Welcome to Connecticut Capital Connection. My name is Senator Gary Winfield. I'm a senator for West Haven and New Haven. And today we are going to be talking to Isa Mujahid. Mujahid. And we are going to be talking about aid in dying, a very important issue that has gotten a lot of attention here in Connecticut and nationally. Nationally, some people in the audience may know that it came to everybody's attention with the impending death of Brittany Maynard. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and what the state of the issue is here in Connecticut. So welcome to the show, Isa.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So Isa, tell me a little bit about the issue of aid in dying largely across the country, and then bring us into Connecticut.
Well, I'm with the ACLU of Connecticut, American Civil Liberties Union. I'm a field organizer. We see aid in dying as a civil liberties issue, and we're supporting the work of Compassion and Choices in Connecticut, which is taking the lead on this issue. We know that bills have been passed and implemented in 5 states, I believe, across the country. We look at Oregon as a model, and Washington State. The Connecticut bill is based on the Oregon law, which has been in effect for over a dozen years, and has, seen some people administer the medication, and also is an example of whether or not certain concerns that people have about aid in dying legislation are actually founded. We can look at the data that has been collected in Oregon. And so there are a handful of states that have passed this legislation, and we hope that Connecticut can be a leader in the country and get this passed this year.
So talk to me a little bit about some of the concerns you mentioned and what the bill is envisioning as ways of dealing with those concerns.
Okay, so I think the first concern that people have is that folks will be coerced to apply for a prescription to end their life, if they fit certain categories. The elderly, folks diagnosed with certain illnesses, and I understand family members concerned that their sickly family member might not get every available treatment to prolong their life. But what the data that we see in Oregon, which has had this bill in place for over a dozen years, as I mentioned, is that the Department of Health there has actually have found 0 instances of coercion or misuse of their Aid in Dying Act. Written in the law are so many measures to prevent misuse of the policy. Dealing with coercion is actually written into the Oregon law and the law we're seeking here in Connecticut, that if anyone is found to have been coerced to apply for the medication, or once they apply for it and receive the medication, of course, that is not, no one is obligated to use it. So again, if there's coercion to, convince someone to use the medication once they have it, if they have not made up their mind to do so, that person will be charged with a felony A. There are so many safeguards in place to make sure that a patient seeking aid in dying has a prognosis of 6 months or left to live, is mentally competent, is doing this, understands the risks, understands that the medication will bring about death, understands exactly what it is that they're asking for, and is required actually to apply for the medication twice, with no less than 15 days in between the applications, so that they have at least 2 weeks to think about this and make sure that this is exactly what they want. And there are other safeguards in this bill as well. It's very comprehensive.
So I think this discussion that we're having right now about the safeguards and about going back a step about the elderly and disabled is pretty important to perhaps why that bill did not move forward last year. Mm-hmm. I think many people who are in what would be the opposition to your position asserted to the Committee of Cognizance and to legislators around the building that the bill wasn't safe, that the elderly might be able to be coerced, as you suggested, and that there is an effort on the part of many people for some reason to get rid of the elderly. There was actually an argument about people being ageist. And so I think it's important that you point out that this is about the end of life and about being judged to be mentally competent. Can you talk a little bit about how that comes about in the bill? I understand that this is a two physician way of doing things. So can you talk a little bit about that so that the audience is aware of what it takes in order to be judged mentally competent?
Okay, so the patient will apply for the medication from their primary physician, the one who they see, the one who may have made the prognosis of 6 months or less to live. Under this law, that doctor, that primary physician, will then have to, that attending physician, as it's called in the law, will then have to make a referral to another physician to confirm that prognosis of 6 months or less. So you get two opinions on the prognosis itself. That prognosis is required to even apply for the medication. And then there is a counseling required by a psychologist or psychiatrist to make sure that someone is mentally competent. If the physician feels that someone is not mentally competent, they have to be, certified by a psychiatrist, psychologist, that they are capable under this law of making this decision for themselves.
Okay. And so talk to me a little bit about the approach that you all are taking to this bill. Is it similar to what you were looking to do last year? How are you thinking about moving this bill, getting people, aside from being on great shows like this, getting people to know what's going on with this issue?
I mean, a lot of times, we understand that getting laws like this passed won't happen the first time around. When someone is facing the end of their life, that's probably it's the most difficult time I think people face, that a family will face, that an individual will face. I mean, the ACLU strongly believes in personal autonomy and people being able to make decisions for themselves, whether it's end of life, whether it's reproductive choice. We believe that the individual whose body, whose life, whose health is in question, if they're mentally competent, should be the person making that decision for themselves. You remember a few years ago when we were working to repeal the death penalty, there was a lot of a lot of emphasis on family members, victims of homicide, and what the victims of homicide face, and the justice that they would want and would seek through the death penalty. I think what successfully got repealed passed in Connecticut is when we also brought in those victims' family members. Their family members have been victims of homicide, and they strongly oppose the death penalty. We saw last year that the opposition to this bill brought in young people, brought in folks who felt, their family members would be the ones who would qualify for this medication, and how difficult it would be for them as family members to have their family members, whether they're elderly, sickly, or they think they fall into these certain categories, that would be coerced to take this medication, and kind of speaking up for them. Again, we feel like the individual should be able to make that decision themselves. And I think this year, what we want to do is have a balance of the voices that are heard. In my work as a field organizer, I meet many young people, older people, spouses of people who have, gone through very difficult last days, who support this legislation. And we want to make sure that their voices are heard as well this year.
I think that's pretty important. With the death penalty, for a number of years, I think many people who are on the side of abolition were fighting the fight of being right and forgetting the stories. And that's why the opposition to that position had the stories, and we had data. We had information, but we lacked the story. So we're almost out of time for this segment. When we come back, what I'm going to want to do is talk a little bit about stories and about what the impact on people are. And I'll tell a little bit about how I came to be involved in this whole discussion and how it's pretty personal for me. And I think that's important for people to know, because oftentimes what we hear is just, well, this is the right thing to do, or here are the numbers. But I think that discussion about what it is, how it impacts people, and how there's something common to all of us really helps us to move anything, particularly those things that are more controversial in this building. So we will talk about that as soon as we get back. Thank you for sitting with me and talking about this issue.
Great, thank you.
Welcome back to Connecticut Capital Connection. I'm here with Isa Mujahid. I got it right that time. Talking about aid in dying, pretty important, pretty heavy subject matter that is being discussed here in the Capitol this year. This is something that's close to me. I wasn't initially someone who was pushing the legislation. I wasn't even involved. The way that I came to be involved in the whole discussion was last year I ran in a special election for the 10th Senatorial District. And during that time I was being covered by Paul Bass of the New Haven Independent, and the issue had already begun. And Paul just offhandedly asked me about my opinion about it, and I told a story about the end of my mother's life and kind of wound up dead smack in the middle of this. And my mother did not live in Connecticut, she lived in New York. But the end of her life was not what I think many people would want the end of anyone's life to be. And it was a difficult, painful time for her. And my mother was somebody who, if you listen to some of the people who are opponents of the position I currently have, they bring into this discussion their religion. My mother was somebody who was very religious and probably initially would have been opposed to this position that I have. I don't know where I would have been. I never really thought about it. But she was someone who, at the end of her life, experienced so much pain with all of the medical technology that we have, that she at points begged to die. And as her son, I had to sit there and watch that. And I think when you experience certain things, the reality of that experience brings you to a position you did not know or never thought you would have. And so I found myself in a place where thinking about the end of a loved one's life was not just something I thought about in the abstract, but something I had the experience with. And so I came to the position where I didn't know why I would say no to people who wanted that relief, wanted the security of knowing they had control over it. And I think those stories help to make this more real, even if people haven't experienced it, because a lot of us, if we haven't experienced that, we've experienced the end of a loved one's life. And we can maybe imagine what it would be like if the end of that life, if it wasn't that bad, were that way. And maybe that helps us to listen a little bit. So talk to me, if you know, about stories, about realities that people maybe need to hear, and that people may hear when the hearing comes up, because I think those are important to help get people to at least listen to a side that they may not initially agree with.
So for myself, I don't have any personal stories. I mean, just like anyone, death is a fact of life. Folks in my family, I've seen, pass away. But in my work, I meet people all the time, as I mentioned in the previous segment, young people, older people who have seen parents, who have seen spouses. I've had conversations with colleagues who have seen people that they love and that they care about go through very difficult deaths. And I think there's a sense of compassion that you have for those family members and absolutely that individual who is going through something you cannot imagine. I mean, you know, there's no one who can say that, you know, they've been through their last days. You know, I think one concern that people might have other than religion is that, you know, it's never over, which, you know, is legitimate. Again, what I'm so passionate about this is that I believe in personal choice. And I think that, you know, folks have religious positions on so many issues. You know, I'll bring up choice again as I did in the previous segment. But I think in the US, and Connecticut in particular, we become very concerned about when people want to legislate their moral values onto all of us. And I have conversation with people of faith whose faith may, you know, frown upon what might be considered suicide. And this is not suicide. These are people who have a prognosis of 6 months or less to live. And barring some very rare, you know, something happening, they're going to leave us. And they want to be in control of how that happens. And we think they deserve that choice. We think they have that right. As, you know, the ACLU, we believe they have a right to make that decision for themselves.
Yeah. You know, the family members sometimes are left with something that I don't think people think about. They're left with the memory of that death, the pain of the memory of that death. And I was listening to NPR one day, and this was before the Brittany Maynard story, about a woman who had chosen to end her life under the statute that you talked about earlier in Oregon, and how her family was alerted to the time of her death, and it happened the way she wanted, and how they walked away, although they still wanted her to be present, and they still loved her, obviously, but they walked away with a memory that wasn't painful, a memory that was actually quite pleasant, if there's any pleasant memory of a loved one dying. And I think sometimes we forget that all of the things we talk about aren't just about the making of law or about one individual, but their impacts, their ripples from the decisions we make. And I think that's something that's important for people to remember. Go ahead.
I mean, while we're talking about NPR, I'll give them a plug as well.
Sure.
I was listening to a story on NPR some months back about this concept of a good death. And it goes back, I don't know how far it goes back, but they were focusing on the Civil War era in the US, where there were so many deaths because of the war. And there was this concept of there are certain circumstances where a person spends their last moments with us, and where they want to be in control of certain aspects of that, so it will be considered a good death. And some of that involved being surrounded by family members as they had their final breaths. And so I remember stories about soldiers, you know, being fatally wounded on the battlefield and spending their last moments, and placing photos of their family members around them, so they had the semblance. So they had as close as what they could get to this good death, and that the word could be passed back to their family members that, you know what, your son, your brother had a good death. And so this is like a long U.S. tradition that we want to be in control of the circumstances as best we can of how we die. And I don't think there's anything out of line with American values with the law that we're trying to pass here in Connecticut. I think it's right along with a long tradition.
Wow, that's interesting. I did not know that. So briefly before we get to the very end of this segment, so this is something that a lot of people are thinking about now. And I mentioned briefly Brittany Maynard, but she helped to kind of open this up to a lot of people. We didn't see the very end of her life, but her death was public. The dying part was public. Do you think that's going to have some impact here in Connecticut, locally?
I think it brought a lot of attention to the law that we didn't, to the bill we're trying to pass that we didn't have last year. I think the awareness is important. I think so folks can educate themselves. We did bring a lot of data last year, and we're bringing that data again this year, but we hope this year to bring a lot more stories like Brittany's and others.
Okay, so we're pretty close to the end of the segment. You are working with several organizations. Make sure that the viewers know what organizations, how they can find you, how they can get in contact. That's pretty important.
Sure. So on Aid in Dying, we're working with Compassion and Choices Connecticut, and we'll have a lobby day here at the Capitol that's open to the public. It's an opportunity for constituents. I'll be here to talk to you as my senator. Okay.
I think you'll find somebody who's open to your position.
Absolutely. That will take place on March 24th, starting at 9:30 a.m. It will be in the old Judiciary Room here at the State Capitol. Folks can RSVP with me at imujahid@acluct.org and find information at our website, acluct.org.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for coming and sharing some information with us. I think it's a pretty important issue. Whatever part of this issue whatever side you come down on, it is something that we will be talking about for the rest of this legislative session. And if it doesn't pass, I suspect we'll be talking about it again in the future. Sure. I think it's one of those issues that we will revisit for a long time, should we not be able to pass the bill. But I think the efforts you and others are putting forward to get this conversation going are relatively important to a lot of the things we do, and particularly important in the lives of those people who really are suffering at the end of life and their families.
Yes.
So thank you again, Isa Mujahid, for showing up and talking with me a little bit, and I look forward to talking to you in the future.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
All right, thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks.